What's up, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Seth, and today we're going to be talking about my Berserker build. Now, there's a couple different builds that you can end up using for the Berserker, and I'm going to kind of go through the theory of some of them that I don't really have the right gear to end up building towards, but I just kind of want to talk about the different potential that you can end up having with this character a little further down the line. And also, I want you to keep in mind that as of right now, I'm only missing a couple of trophies that will actually end up giving you skill points, right? So certain trophies that you end up getting are going to actually give you skill points, and I'm only missing these two right here, so I'm only essentially missing 2 skill points. So keep that in mind if you're at level 60 and your build doesn't look like this with the extra amount of skill points. Now, those extra 2 I'm probably just gonna end up putting into Bloodlust. The most common thing that you can end up doing for testing all the DPS is you just go to a guild house. I still haven't double checked. I think you can put a practice dummy in your house, but I haven't actually checked it yet. And essentially what you're going to be doing is just spinning to winning while using the Grand Slam or Ground Slam over and over again, right? This is kind of the more popular build with this character, is just getting up to 10 stacks and then just slamming down over and over again, not using any of your other abilities, doing one swing and then doing the Ground Slam over and over again. But I actually found out that you can do one better. It's only a little bit better, so this is kind of just down to personal preference, okay? But what I actually use is, I've just been calling it the Grand Slam build, just because it makes sense to me. But essentially, you're going to be using, in combination, you're going to be using Dark Breaker fully maxed out. What this is going to do is, as soon as you end up getting 10 stacks, you can slam down with this, and it's going to cause 582% dark damage, but then it's also going to do an additional 238 dark damage over time. So that's going to be over the course of 5 seconds. And this is where it's kind of up to personal preference, whether you want to just use the Ground Breaker over and over, or take the extra risk of using the Dark Breaker, where of course most enemies, most people would argue that this skill is not as useful as using Ground Breaker at 10 stacks, because no enemies are going to be standing in place for 5 full seconds. However, I ended up actually testing it out, and I'll mention the different damage numbers for what I ended up doing with these different builds, and why I think this one is the most superior. Most of all is because you're adding in Bloodlust. And the reason why I like to add in Bloodlust is not only does it give you a lot more survivability as the Berserker, but on top of it, you're going to be doing 183% weapon damage 2 times. So you're going to end up dealing 100, yeah, it says 2 times right then and there. So that's over 200, close to 300%. Actually, I think that is 300% extra damage just by doing the in and out, like the stab and then the retraction motion, right? Now, the reason why I like mixing that in is because rather than doing the ground pound, the ground slam, where you end up taking one swipe and then you end up doing more of your ground slam, of course, you end up generating more spirit when you end up having 10 stacks. This kind of takes the animation time that your normal swing would end up taking in between the ground slam in general, and then usually you'll end up having enough spirit afterwards to end up doing some more ground slams, and then on top of that, that's just extra DPS, like that's just extra amount of damage on top of it. However, this big buster right here, I really like using that one because you kind of mix that in. It's going to naturally, as you saw right there, we just used it once and it ended up building an additional 6 stacks all to its own. So then you end up doing a stab, and then you can do a couple ground slams, and then you're already at another 10 stacks before you know it, and then you can end up just using the ability again. So it's very, very good as far as just generating stacks and generating that constant damage output. This isn't really going to be gauged very well right here because I'm actually attacking like all of these dummies, so you gotta kind of be careful when you're trying to test this out so that you only attack one at a time, and you don't want to combat pet on, yada yada yada. So that's why it's just overall kind of better for me. I'll explain the rest of the build, but just to give you some raw numbers here, I was testing out a bunch of things, and the ground slam, just with like the ground slam only at 10 stacks was doing roughly 2.9 mil damage a minute for me, and I'm actually rocking a +11 sword, by the way, I should have actually mentioned. And then I ended up actually doing more damage by using the ground slam mixed with using the dark might. So just by having that extra dark might, you get a lot more extra attack speed. It ends up taking all of your 10 stacks, but that extra attack speed plus that extra 16% of more damage ends up making up for the fact that you're spending all of your 10 stacks on the ground slam. But that was using a macro, by the way. You can end up just grabbing a macro with the macro settings right here. You just set up all the spells that you want to actually be used. And this right here, this is what ended up being like the absolute best damage out of all of them. So ground slam plus the leeching, so the bloodlust, that was actually 3.3 mil. And then the grand slam with all of the, that 3.1 mil. That was with the groundbreaker and the bloodlust, just those ones macroed out in here. But this one that you see right here with all of it, this was the one that was 3.3 mil. So I was roughly doing 200k more damage just overall within a minute. And of course that's going to end up adding over time. Now you gotta consider that the enemies are gonna be moving around, so maybe that's where you could argue that the Darkbreaker isn't going to end up being as useful. But you can see with this one, obviously we're going to end up doing a lot more damage when this is at 10 stacks, but honestly I still would argue that this is a little bit better, just because that 200k extra damage is a lot of cushion room in case the enemy does end up missing or dodging the additional dark aura that's on the ground. You're still gonna be doing pretty close to, if not the same amount of damage of just using the groundbreaker over and over. I know I keep saying groundbreaker and grand slam and I keep mixing up the meaning behind it, but hey, whatever. So I want to put into perspective, it was only better if you end up using this like a macro so that you're casting on cooldown like as soon as possible. That said, for my own personal preference, I just like doing it all manually, just because it gives me a lot more mobility rather than just holding one button down and then having the character kind of constantly conflict with your own abilities and stuff. Now, let's talk about the skills themselves and why these are what they are, and why they're going to end up being so useful for you. So you're going to be going into the Warrior's Instinct, obviously, because that's going to end up giving you physical resistance by 60, and also give you piercing by 6.4. So that's just extra damage as well as some extra defense, and you're already tanky enough as it is. I like having the Great Sword Mastery maxed out because that is going to end up just giving you an additional 6.4 extra damage. If you end up going for your Dark Might, it can end up being pretty good, but then you're gonna be spending all of your 10 stacks, so you don't really get to use the Dark Breaker anyways. And ultimately, it just, out of everything that I tested out, it's just generally better to have the Great Sword Mastery, because that's just more passive damage that you're dealing with there. And then Bloodlust, again, I already said why this is going to end up being good for you. And then you're just going to be using the Death Spin and the Groundbreaker, and kind of just using all those main 4 abilities over and over. You could, I guess, put some skills into Adrenaline Rush, but I personally don't recommend it, because then you're going to have to be at 60% health or less to actually have this be effective. And with your Bloodlust, you're pretty much just stealing life all the time anyways. Now, what I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video is the potential of the character is really, really cool, because if you actually have some insane amounts of crit, you can end up speccing into the Deep Wounds. And I actually saw this as a build that somebody ended up suggesting on Reddit, where essentially every time you end up doing critical attacks with your greatsword, you're going to deal an additional 4% damage every second for 10 seconds. And that can stack as well. So apparently this is pretty good for bosses like Fire Drake, for example, where you end up getting all of that bleeding proc over and over and stacking it up, so that while he's running around, he's still taking the same amount of damage as if you were actually attacking him. So that can end up being a good build for the Berserker, but mostly just for more active bosses. And again, to argue the point of why I actually like the Darkbreaker build, or I keep calling it Grand Slam, I should call it Darkbreaker build, honestly. But why I like using this build that I'm using is because more often than not, the bosses are static. Like, they're just going to be standing still anyways. it just kind of happens. And even bosses like Fire Drake, you know, you're going to be able to put the hurt on him when he's standing still doing his attacks. When he gets to his final phase, you can just keep using Dark Breaker over and over and over again, and it's ultimately, I'd say it ends up being more beneficial than using the Groundbreaker. Now, again, the difference between using the Groundbreaker build and then Darkbreaker is very, very small. So you can go ahead and spec however you want. It's not like this game is overly complicated just yet. It will be eventually when the Awakened update comes out, but there's no release date set for that one. The Korean server has the Awakened update, the global server does not, but that's when they end up re-overhauling a lot of the characters and a lot of the different abilities and stuff like that. And that's when it ends up getting a whole lot more complicated than it does now. Plus, we're playing as a Berserker. There's not really that much to this character. It's in a good way, It's actually very simple. So anyways, that's the build that I've been using. Lots of people keep asking me about it when I'm doing my live streams and stuff like that. I just wanted to let you know. I thought it was pretty cool because I ended up kind of messing around with this a little bit. Tried someone else's build who mentioned, you know, using the Groundbreaker and using it with Warrior's Instinct. And then I decided to start using the Darkbreaker. And then I thought, wait a minute, you know, the Bloodlust is actually a little bit better. And then when somebody ended up suggesting to me that the Groundbreaker was the best build for the Zerk, I wanted to try attempting that against my Darkbreaker Grand Slam build, and it like I said, we were doing 200k more damage with my build. Now, that said, you know, it is pretty random. It could have been that I ended up getting more crits that time when I was testing out the damage, so who knows? But again, you know, the difference is very, very close, so you can either use the Grand Slam or you can end up using the Groundbreaker. It's entirely up to you, but this is the build that I use. I don't mean to keep repeating myself, so thanks for watching. Very much appreciate it. Don't forget to like, sub, hit that notification bell. If you want to support me, you can always sponsor the YouTube channel with that join button down below. Buy some of my merch, which is in the description, or if you don't have any money but you still want to help me out, there's a link down below to Gawkbox, which is a way that you can donate to me for absolutely free by playing phone games for a couple minutes. Sign on and stay epic, everybody.